I'm good. Okay. Oh, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out to this panel. The name of the panel for today is The Science Behind Mental Health. Just a quick survey. How many of you have heard of the word or the term mental health? Awesome. I was hoping that that's what it would look like. Today we have 5 wonderful panelists who are going to be talking about different aspects of mental health. They're all doing wonderful research, and the areas that they focus on are bullying and harassment, snacking and exercise, self-esteem, substance abuse, and eating disorder. The way the session is going to work is that I'll introduce all 5 of the wonderful panelists. They'll have about 15 minutes to share with you the work that they're doing. And then once all the panelists have wrapped up, I will ask a few questions. I will open it up to the audience. And also just a reminder that this session is being webcast, so then I'll be taking questions via webcast if there's any. Can we just get a round of applause for our wonderful panelists that we have here today, please? And do we have any high school students in the audience? Show of hands. I see some people that look like, okay, what high school are you guys from? Mark Garneau, welcome. Any other high school students in the audience? Yep, go ahead. Northern Secondary, welcome. Any other high school students in the audience? Grade 8, okay. What school are you guys from? Churchill Heights Public School. Welcome. Thank you guys for being here. This panel is about young people that are in your age category, so thank you very much for coming out and making sure that you're here. Research is definitely important. So to get the panel started off, I'm going to introduce the speakers. So first up, we have Tracy Vaillancourt from the University of Ottawa. She's going to be talking about bullying and harassment. She's the current research chair in children's mental health and violence prevention at the University of Ottawa, where she's cross-appointed as full professor in the Faculty of Education, Counseling Program, and in the School of Psychology, Faculty of Social Science. Dr. Vaillancourt is also an elected member of the College of the Royal Society of Canada and is a core member of Orford Centre for Child Studies at McMaster University. She received her BA, MA, and PhD from the University of British Columbia, Human Development, her postdoctoral diploma from the University of Montreal and Laval, and development psychology, and a postdoctoral respecialization in applied child psychology clinical from McGill University. Dr. Vaillancourt's research examines the links between aggression and children's mental health functioning, with a particular focus on the neurobiology of peer victimization. She's currently funded by the Canadian Institute for Health Research. So join me in welcoming Dr. Vaillancourt to do her presentation.
So I can tell that you're a lot younger than we are, because when they were saying which high schools they were from, I couldn't even hear them. So I'm going to talk about bullying and harassment, and I'm going to link it first to mental health. Then I'm going to talk about why we have differences in outcome, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience behind that. So just in terms of putting things in perspective, if we think about mental health difficulties among Canadian children, we know that about 15 to 20% of children and youth in Canada have serious mental health problems. So this would mean about 15 to 20% would meet diagnostic criteria for a mental health disorder. The thing about mental health issues is that they typically begin in childhood. So about 50 to 75% of adults who have mental health difficulties, their difficulties began in childhood before the age of 15. Mental health problems in youth are the leading cause of health-related burden, and in adults, according to the World Health Organization, depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide. So this has now trumped cardiovascular problems. So people who study mental health, if you're interested in your future career, I encourage you to really think about going into mental health, the field of mental health. So my call for action for the adults in the room, but especially for the young people in the room, is if we want to reduce this issue, so the burden of mental health problems and the high prevalence rate that we see in Canada, I think we actually need to reduce bullying. I think bullying should be a public health initiative. And the reason why I say this is because the research that is done by people like myself and other scientists from around the world suggests that bullying causes mental health problems. And I know that most people won't make such a statement unless there's an empirical study that has a randomization or some sort of design like that. But we also know from longitudinal studies where we control for symptomology at time 1 and we look at the effects of bullying moving forward that it does seem to be the case. So study after study from around the world is suggesting that bullying causes mental health problems. So what is bullying? When we're talking about bullying, I think the best definition in the world is to use the Ministry of Education's definition. So the Ontario Ministry of Education has a definition. Every school in Ontario is compelled to use it through Bill 13. And basically what it's saying is that it's negative actions that are repeated. So they're directed at somebody by somebody else who has more power than them. And it's done over and over again. The problem with bullying or harassment is that the term is overly applied. So people will say if they were teased in a way that they didn't quite like, that they were being bullied. So all these incivilities that we see happen, we tend to use the term bullying. But it actually doesn't do justice to the kind of work that I do or the suffering that children have as a consequence of this, because I'm talking about the end of the spectrum. I'm talking about kids and youth, teens, who get this every single day of their life, and they cannot defend themselves because they have less power. In terms of the scope of the problem with bullying, about 35% of Canadian children and teenagers report that they've been bullied within the past 2 months, occasionally. Of those 35%, 10% are bullied on a daily basis. So every day they go to school, they're treated poorly by their peers. And this means that about 500,000, so 500,000 children and youth in Canada have that miserable existence on a daily basis. Canada doesn't actually have much to be proud of. In the latest UNICEF report, where they compared economically advantaged countries, what they found was that Canada ranked in the top third of the worst offenders. And in another study where they used surveillance study comparing these rich nations on their bullying prevalence rates, what they found was that almost all of the countries had reductions in bullying over the last 12 years, with the exception of Canada and the UK. Our bullying rates actually increased when everybody else in the world seems to be going down. So we need to be doing something about this. We need to be doing something about it because, as I mentioned, it causes mental health difficulties. So if you look at this collection of issues that are associated with bullying, you see that children and youth who are bullied have academic difficulties, so they don't want to go to school. So there's increased absenteeism and truancy. They have somatic complaints, so they complain of stomach aches and headaches and the like. They have stress-related illnesses, and they even have bona fide physical health problems. They're more likely to get colds and flus and the like. They have low self-esteem, depression, social withdrawal and isolation, social anxiety, loneliness, suicide, and aggressive behavior. Our recent study that we published in the Journal of Developmental Psychology following kids forward from the time they were in grade 5 until the end of grade 8, what we found was that kids started on a trajectory of being victimized and then became bullies in the future. So when kids get bullied, they either become sad or they get mad. Now the thing about this is that recent studies have been following people from when they're really little up until they're quite old, and what they've shown is that the effects of bullying in childhood are long-standing. So in this study that was recently published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, what they did was they followed people who were bullied in childhood and those who weren't, and compared their outcomes, health outcomes at 50 years later. And what they found was that those who had been bullied in childhood fared worse, even 50 years after the fact. In fact, their health outcomes, their mental health outcomes, were as bad as those who had been institutionalized in foster care or who had experienced other childhood adversities, such as extreme poverty or child maltreatment. Now this raises the question, what is the temporal sequence? I've kind of already given the answer away, but a lot of people ask me this. Is it the case that kids are bullied and then become unwell as a consequence of that poor treatment? Or is it the case that the peer group's picking up on the fact that they're unwell to begin with, they bully them, and then they become more unwell as a consequence of that poor treatment? Most of the studies suggest that the temporal sequence is that first one, that kids become unwell as a consequence of being bullied. There's a handful of children that absolutely exists where you see a symptom-driven pathway where some children and youth have mental health difficulties to begin with, the peer group picks up on that and they treat them poorly. But for the most part, Canadian children are mandated to attend school for 6 hours in the day. And they attend school with, all the hopes and aspirations that you would want for them. And they get derailed because their peers treat them poorly. Now, just one concrete example. So if you look at all of the collection of studies here, these are all gold standard studies, following kids forward from one time to another, holding their symptoms, mental health difficulties constant at time one and the like. And these studies over and over again, including meta-analyses, suggest that peer victimization leads to increases in depression and anxiety in ensuing years. Now, having said that, if that's the temporal sequence, we also know that not all children some fare better and some fare worse. So not all children become ill as a consequence of being treated poorly. So my current research interest is understanding the moderators. So I'm really interested in understanding why is it that some kids have poor outcomes when they're bullied and others seem to do better when they're bullied. And there's a bunch of studies suggesting several different moderators. Environmental characteristics, such as being in a better home. Some children who are bullied are maltreated in their home, so it's kind of like a double whammy. Studies have shown that if you're treated poorly by your peers, but you have a good home life, your outcomes seem to be better. The classroom also seems to matter. Studies have shown that kids, if they're the only person being bullied in their classroom, they tend to do worse than kids where there's a lot of kids who are bullied in the classroom. It seems like an awful way to handle this where we want more kids to be victimized, but the identity or the attribution of the person who's the only one being victimized, their attribution is it must be me. Whereas if a lot of people are being bullied in their classroom, they think that it must be the person who's doing it to them. Personal characteristics also matter. So gender seems to be a really important one. For example, in one study, being relationally victimized, so being excluded from the peer group and the like, at any frequency was associated with suicidal attempts for adolescent girls. But for teenage boys, it was only when it was at the extreme end of that continuum. And in another study, internalizing problems like depression and anxiety persisted for girls after the bullying had stopped, whereas for boys that wasn't the case. Once the bullying had stopped, their mental health had improved. I'm particularly interested in the neurobiology of peer victimization and understanding biological vulnerability. And I'm going to give you one example, and then I think I'm done with my time. So there was a study published in 2003 in one of the biggest journals in the world, Science. It was published by Caspi et al., where they looked at a polymorphism of the 5-HTT-LPR gene. So this is a serotonin transporter gene, and there's a polymorphism on whether or not you would have a long gene, long, short, or short. So they looked at people who had been maltreated in childhood, so the worst experiences of maltreatment you can imagine, so severe maltreatment, and they looked at the effects of having this type of gene on the outcome of being depressed at age 26. And what they found was that if the person had been severely maltreated in childhood and had the short 5-HTT-LPR gene, polymorphism of their 5-HTT gene, they had about a 70% chance of being depressed at age 26. If they had the exact same experience, so they were treated poorly by their caregivers, so this is severe maltreatment, and they had a protective gene, a long gene, their chances of being depressed at age 26 was no greater than if they hadn't been abused. This has been replicated in 4 recent studies looking at kids who are bullied. So kids who are bullied, who have the short risk gene for depression. In this one study by Bengent, girls who were bullied by other girls in a relationally way, so excluded from the peer group and the like, were 3 times more likely to be depressed if they had a short 5-HTT-LPR than if they had a long. So when we think about heterogeneity and outcomes, we also have to think that there is also some invisible scars, or that the experience of bullying can get under the skin and confer a risk for future health outcomes. And this is critical for the work that I do in terms of policy, because a lot of times people don't want to act because they'll use that one kid who was bullied and seem to have fared well. You know, we always have those motivation speakers who come out and say, you know, I'm a a billionaire now. I'm a gazillionaire, and I was bullied, and because I was bullied, I'm all the better for it. And we use those people as examples of not having to do anything. We're apathetic because we say, you see, there's something about that person. They're constitutionally strong, and this made them a better person. And then we blame the person who's not doing well, and we say there must be something wrong with them. But nobody in this room, and I'd hedge a big bet that nobody in this room knows what their polymorphism is for their 5-HTT-LPR. And because of that, there could be an invisible risk. So I'm going to ask all of you, especially the adolescents in the room, that you're going to stand up for your peers who are being harassed at school and never stand by. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next speaker, I would just like to encourage the audience, especially the younger students in the audience, to listen carefully and do not be afraid to ask questions. I've been one of those people at a conference where I didn't understand something that was said, but I'm like, that's too simple. I'm not going to ask. It's going to be embarrassing. Somebody asks a question and everybody's like, whoa, that's a great question. So please, I encourage you, do not be afraid to ask any questions. Make note, and we'll have time for questions at the end of the panel. So our next speaker is Peter Hall from the University of Toronto. His research examines cognitive factors that influence prevention of or adaptation to chronic illness that affect older adults, particularly type 2 diabetes. He also has a strong interest in population-level prevention of these same conditions. Much of his research is conducted from a social neuroscience perspective and involves behavioral, neuroimaging, and survey methodologies. Dr. Hall holds an affiliate scientist position at the Toronto General Research Institute and is a member of the University of Waterloo Chronic Disease Prevention Initiative. His research is supported by the Canadian Institute of Health Research and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Dr. Hall is a past recipient of the CIHR New Investigator Award and a 2011 recipient of the Young Investigator Award from the Canadian Psychological Association. He is a co-author of the Canadian Diabetes Association Clinical Practice Guidelines for psychological aspects of diabetes and management. Please welcome our next presenter, Dr. Peter Hall.
Hey, first, thank you for the compliment, but I'm actually from University of Waterloo rather than U of T, but I appreciate the compliment anyway. So the topic of my talk is snacking. And of course, we all have some intuitive sense that snacking is not a great thing to do in excess. There's lots of health-related reasons, kind of these intermediate ones that you might experience even in adolescence and certainly in young adulthood a little bit later, where you notice that if you snack too much, you tend to gain weight, your body doesn't look quite as you would like it to. Likewise, of course, further down the road, snacking in excess does tend to predispose people to all kinds of health conditions that we would probably rather avoid that affect people probably your parents' age and older. So there's lots of reasons why we should want to understand snacking and maybe study it from a scientific perspective. What I'm going to do today is give you just a few examples of studies from our lab. All of them are experimental studies where we try to understand snacking behavior in a systematic way from a social neuroscience kind of perspective. So what does social neuroscience have to do with snacking? It's useful to sort of get right into the brain structures that we know might be involved here. As it turns out, there are structures, or I should say systems in the brain that we know are responsible for certain types of functions. There are lots of things about the brain that we don't understand fully, and we're still working out the details, even with respect to the one that I'm going to be talking about. But we know that the prefrontal cortex, which is the area that's highlighted in red here, I'm going to try it works, good. The area highlighted in red there. The prefrontal cortex, and specifically one particular area of it called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, but I'm just going to say prefrontal cortex because it's too many syllables to say dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And I can also use the abbreviation of PFC. So the PFC, we know, is implicated in the cognitive control of emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. So you can think of the prefrontal cortex as at least being a very important part of a brain system that's involved in self-control. It essentially is our self-control resource. And we tend to rely on it in the following types of situations: when we're trying to avoid something tempting that we normally might be impelled to consume or approach, when we're doing something that is the opposite of habit, trying to do something differently that we normally do engage in, even if it's not something tempting, just something that we normally do on a regular basis, or when we're trying to behave in ways that do not involve impulse. We're trying to counter some impulse to do something. We tend to be relying on the prefrontal cortex. A couple of other brain systems that are relevant to snacking behavior and some of the other topics that we'll be talking about today, or your other speakers will be talking about today. The limbic system is known to be implicated in the generation of emotion, motivation, as well as memory. One particular part of the limbic system is quite interesting, and I know we'll be hearing a lot about this later, is the amygdala. Part of its job is to generate negative emotional responses, especially high activation negative emotions. So you might think, why do we want a part of our brain to generate these types of emotions? Why do we need high activation negative emotions like anxiety or anger? There's lots of evolutionary reasons why we actually might want systems that generate those types of emotions, because they motivate us to go away from things that are dangerous, avoid things that are dangerous, or perhaps engage in aggressive behavior when survival depends upon it. So I won't get into that any further beyond saying that the amygdala is a system that's involved, part of a system that's involved in the generation of negative emotions. The striatum also is something we'll be hearing more about later, so I'll just very briefly touch on it here. And I apologize, my graphics have shifted a bit there. It's not quite on the right spot. The striatum is known, especially the ventral striatum, as the primary reward center in the brain. So you've probably heard of feel-good neurochemicals like dopamine, serotonin. These are the types of neurochemistry that are affected by antidepressant medications, for example. They also tend to be released in response to ingesting appetitive substances of abuse. And that is the reason why, partially why they are addictive. It turns out that the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, has a modulatory relationship with both of those centers, that it can dampen down the activity of those other emotion generation centers in the limbic system and the reward-based centers in the ventral striatum. And this is potentially important, possibly when trying to understand snacking behavior. So snacking, high-calorie food is almost universally rewarding for human beings. There's lots of evolutionary reasons why that may be the case. Just very briefly, the last 100-year part of our history has been characterized, in not all parts of the world, but most parts of the world, by extreme food abundance, relative ease of accessibility. But evolution does not work in 50-year or 100-year chunks. And our bodies have been engineered over thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps millions of years, to be quite different from that, to adapt to most of our evolutionary history, the context of which was characterized by the opposite of today, that is very low food availability and a high amount of energy expenditure required to attain food. So it makes sense that we may be biased, or we are a machine that should be biased towards the idea of gaining as much energy from food as possible for each unit of energy expended trying to get it. So you don't want to be expending a lot of energy to get food that is not going to give you much energy back. You can imagine the survival advantage goes in the opposite direction. If you're going to expend energy, it had better be for calorie-dense foods, that is energy-rich foods. And so a lot of the snack foods that we currently consume are exactly that, and overconsume are exactly that. It turns out there are very reliable, experimentally demonstrated human taste preferences for high-fat and high-sugar foods. And in fact, this is not even limited to humans. There are many organisms demonstrate those exact same preferences. So if you give them a substance to eat, and you just, without the awareness of the human or the animal in the research paradigm, you vary the amount of sugar and fat, they tend to consume more of the high sugar and high fat alternatives. even when it's not obvious which one is which. So we have these default preferences to consume food, yet we also have the capacity to restrain ourselves from just eating every bit of high-calorie food out there. The prefrontal cortex is known to be an evolutionarily new structure of the brain. That is, if you go into lower organisms, it's much less developed, and some would argue that if you go down far enough, you will find organisms that even sort of at the level of the rodent model that don't really have an analogous structure. So it's the developed prefrontal cortex is a highly, a very human type of structure. So we wondered whether or not in our lab the operation of the prefrontal cortex is implicated in the ability to resist snacking foods when they're present. So we decided to use a technique to alter the function temporarily, very temporarily, about 15 minutes of the prefrontal cortex using a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation. It uses this coil that you see up here to generate a series of magnetic pulses at a certain frequency and amplitude that can either cause the brain structure below it to temporarily increase in function, enhance its efficiency, or temporarily dampen down its function. And in this paradigm, we decided to dampen down the function of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or the PFC, to see what effect that might have on cravings for snack food and actual consumptive behavior in relation to snack food. Now, it's an experiment, so what we actually had people do is come in at 2 different time points. They did the same paradigm at each time point. They underwent TMS, the active form of TMS, which temporarily downgrades the prefrontal cortex, or sham stimulation, where we had them do the same setup and just turn the coil 180 degrees so the pulses are going the other way. So everything is exactly the same, except in the sham stimulation, they do not actually receive the electromagnetic pulses, and so there are no changes or very minimal changes in the operation of the prefrontal cortex. So the question is, under the actual stimulation, when we're actually reducing prefrontal cortex function, does that result in disinhibition of craving? Do people experience more cravings for appetitive foods? And do they actually consume more of these foods as well? So we set up a taste test that they did after the TMS, the active or sham version of TMS. And in this taste test, we had them sample 3 different foods that were sort of pre-tested as being fairly universally yummy. I think you will agree. Belgian milk chocolate, original Pringles, and flavor Pringles. And just to be kind of paranoid about the whole thing, we only selected people for the study who already acknowledged having frequent cravings for these, because we want to make sure we got people in the study who already like these foods. So we gave them an opportunity to taste these foods and make ratings of them. And we actually recorded the amount that they ate during the process of giving those ratings. So the ratings were things like texture, saltiness, sweetness, and that sort of thing. And this is what we found. During the, I should mention, there is also control food, plain soda crackers unsalted, fairly flavorless, also low calorie. We wanted a control food to see whether or not the effects that we observed were selective to high energy density snack foods, or if it applied to all foods. So as you can see here, there's no difference between the sham and active stimulation in terms of the amount of control food consumed. So there's a slight difference in the bars there, but that's just error. It's not statistically significant. But there is a difference in the appetitive food consumed, specifically in the direction that in the condition where we actually dampened people's PFC activity, they consumed more snack food. In addition, I didn't mention this initially, but before we let them loose on the taste test, we showed them images of the food, attractive images of the appetitive food, and got them to give us ratings about their craving responses to those images. And as you can see on this slide, there is also more craving evidenced after the actual stimulation than the sham stimulation. So in terms of the question, does the prefrontal cortex assist with self-control of snacking? Evidence from this study and a few others like it that have been executed in other labs does seem to support the idea that the prefrontal cortex does help to keep cravings in check and also helps to keep consumptive levels in check selectively for tasty foods. Does exercise help? I know I was supposed to be talking to you a little bit about exercise. We did another study where we had people do the TMS and immediately after a bout of moderate exercise or control exercise, very minimal effort exercise. And what we found is that exercise actually helps to mitigate the effects of TMS on the prefrontal cortex, that it corrects people back up to normal much more quickly than would otherwise take place. So there's an interesting relationship between exercise and snacking behavior, or at least self-control processes that are mediated through the prefrontal cortex. A last question we wanted to ask was specifically because we study social neuroscience, that is social contacts and its influence on behavior through the brain. We wondered whether or not there are certain social situations under which prefrontal cortex function mattered more than others. So we tried to vary this experimentally by providing people with different cues before they did that taste test that I mentioned in that prior study. So this is a new study, actually a set of two studies, where we had another group of individuals come in and we gave them one of three sets of instructions for the taste test. In one condition, we said eat as much as you like in order to make your ratings. That is, we gave them a cue that was kind of facilitating in nature. In another, we suggested eat only the bare minimum to make your ratings, so that's kind of a restraining cue. And then in a third condition, we gave them no specific instructions other than orienting them to the taste test. So the question is, under which conditions, the facilitating conditions, the restraining conditions, or the neutral conditions, under what conditions did the prefrontal cortex seem to predict how much people ate? In this case, we're not manipulating the prefrontal cortex, we're just measuring people's strength of prefrontal cortex functioning when they come into the lab. So people all vary slightly in the strength of the prefrontal cortex, and we had a test to measure that. So as you can see here, differences in prefrontal cortex function only mattered under the facilitating conditions. That is, when you say to people, eat as much as you like, you give them license to eat as much as you like in order to make your ratings. That's where the differences between people with high and low prefrontal cortex function actually manifested in how much they ate in the taste test. We did a second study, and this time involving the older adults. The prior two studies were younger adults, where we decided to see how general that effect might be. That is, if we use visual cues rather than a semantic or word-related cue, does that make a difference? Does that produce the same types of patterns of findings? So we created two types of cues. One is a restraining cue, conceptually speaking, where we collapsed a food pyramid into a plate here. In the second cue, the appetitive version of that, we replaced it with a pizza. And the third version, we had just a blank poster. We didn't direct anyone's attention to these things. We just placed them in their visual field. So when they were doing their taste test, they would have seen these things. And the question is, which cue is associated with higher levels of consumption as a function of individual differences in prefrontal cortex function? And we found the same pattern of findings approximately, where the facilitating cue appeared to be the one that revealed differences between those with high and low prefrontal cortex function in their actual snacking behavior. So it seems that the prefrontal cortex is an important unit or module of the self-control network when it comes to snacking. It's useful to maybe end off with just a few thoughts on how you can protect or optimize your prefrontal cortex. Luckily, it is one of those brain systems that we can improve and we can manage through our behavior. So exercise is probably the primary means through which we can enhance and optimize the functioning of the prefrontal cortex. Both single bouts of exercise and more extended training, especially aerobic exercise, tends to enhance and optimize the prefrontal cortex. As well, in addition to this, healthy diet helps, especially in relation to vitamin E. Social contact with the natural environment. These are things that we don't very much know why this is the case, but we think there's something about complexity of social environments and natural environments, more so than the man-made environment, that helps to challenge the brain and keeps some of these networks optimized. Challenging games, that's one that I think we should be a little bit cautious about. The evidence is weakest for that category, despite the fact that we get the most advertising about that category because of the commercial potential. There is some potential for brain training to work, but there have been very few studies that have demonstrated it. We probably don't have the optimal combination of components at this point. Learning new things, especially learning new languages, has been demonstrated to have positive effects on prefrontal function, as well as getting restorative sleep, that is getting good nights of sleep in terms of length and also deep sleep. So that about covers what I wanted to go over with respect to snacking and brain function. Thank you.
Thank you. And that was Dr. Peter Hall from the University of Waterloo. Up next, we have Diana Kollick from Laurentian University talking about self-esteem. Diana has worked at Laurentian University since 2001. She obtained her PhD at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, her MSW degree at the University of Toronto. She's currently the director of the School of Social Work and teaches social work, theory, and practice in the undergrad and graduate programs. For several years, she also facilitated the theory course for the interdisciplinary PhD program in rural and northern health. Diana is a practicing clinical social worker with 20 years of experience and has been a board member of the local chapter of the Ontario Association of Social Workers since 2005. At Laurentian, she is a core member of the research group ECHO, Evaluating Children's Health Outcomes, and you can also go to the website echoresearchcenter.com to find out more about that project. Diana's research has focused on investigating the effectiveness of arts-based and mindfulness-based group work for the improvement of resilience and self-concept, particularly in vulnerable children. This research has been in collaboration with the Children's Aid Society of the districts of Sudbury and Manitoulin and the Child and Family Center. Information about that research can be found on her website at dianekollick.com. Diana is also the academic director for the Northeast Ontario region of the Youth Rex project that has a mission to make research evidence and evaluation accessible and relevant to Ontario's youth sector through knowledge mobilization, capacity building, and evaluation leadership. Please see, for more information on that project, you can also go to the website youthrex.com. Please welcome Diana Kollick to the stage.
Good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here today to tell you a little bit about my research that looks at the effectiveness of arts-based mindfulness group activities for the development of self-esteem and resilience in vulnerable children. So I wanted to kind of show you on this map where Sudbury is. I live in Sudbury. That's where Laurentian University is. Yesterday, I think it took 40 minutes to fly up here. It'll take you about 4 hours to drive up there. One of the advantages of living in a smaller city like Sudbury is it's not that difficult to make collaborative relationships with key organizations in the community. And when you do research like mine, you need to have those collaborations. So two of the agencies that I've been very involved with are the Child and Family Center, which is the mental health service for young people in Sudbury, and the Children's Aid Society. This is just a list of some of the students that have trained as part of my team. And I would just really encourage all the young people here today that if you go to university, get to know your professors and get to know what they're doing. And if you're interested in what they're doing, approach them. Because I'm often looking for students to train with me. I need a research team to do the kind of research that we do. So don't be afraid to do that. So some of these students and practitioners became part of my team because they actually sought me out. So I've had I've had a commitment to working with people who are marginalized my whole career. And basically, I'm interested in knowing how arts-based group work that teaches mindfulness to vulnerable children and youth can help these children to feel better about themselves and to cope better with day-to-day life. So who are vulnerable children? In my research, these are children that are involved with either the child welfare or the mental health sectors. So overall, these children can struggle with things like low self-esteem, trouble feeling optimistic or hopeful, and trouble expressing feelings in a productive way, which then you can imagine interferes in their ability to have good relationships with their peers. So, for example, Edward was a 10-year-old boy who witnessed his mother being physically abused by his father for many years. So in the group work, he sometimes verbally put down the other group members. Rachel was an 8-year-old girl who was living in foster care. She was very anxious. She had a lot of trouble maintaining eye contact with the other group members and the facilitators, and she'd often put down her arts-based creations, saying they're no good or they're stupid. And Susan was a 12-year-old girl who was also living in foster care, but she was very talkative and very gregarious, and she wanted to have instant relationships and friendships with the group members and the facilitators and wanted to constantly hug people. So hopefully you can see from those descriptions that vulnerable children are a very diverse group, and they're affected differently by their challenging life experiences, but all of them share the characteristic of having low self-esteem. So the group work that we do essentially tries to help them improve their self-esteem. And what's self-esteem? It's basically a realistic and appreciative opinion of yourself. And there's a link between self-esteem and self-awareness, which I'm going to get to in a minute. So we call the program that we developed a holistic arts-based program, HAP for short. And these are basically the goals of HAP. So to learn mindfulness, to improve your self-awareness, to develop self-compassion and empathy, and to shore up your strengths. So it took us about 3 years of research with children to develop the program, and then we had another 3 years where we tested it with about 100 children. So we hope that HAP can help vulnerable children improve their resilience and their self-esteem, which includes things like coping more effectively at home and school, appreciating their skills, and just feeling happier and satisfied with life. So if you ask the children who have been through HAP to describe the program, most of the time they say it's a lot of fun. So what do they think is really fun about the program? It's the arts-based activities, it's making friends, and eating snacks. And we've had a lot of success with the program. We find that it helps some children improve their mood, improve their coping, and help them to develop social skills, and importantly, helps them to develop an ability to focus and pay attention. So today, I'm just focusing on the self-esteem part. So here are some quotes that speak specifically to having improved confidence and self-esteem. So once the children finish the group, we always interview them with their guardians one-on-one. So the interviewer asks John, do you feel differently about yourself? John says, yes, I'm more confident. I can talk in front of my class now. Yeah, a little bit. Terry says, I've changed a lot in these groups. More upbeat, positive, happy, confident. I have a higher self-esteem now. Jack says, I changed to look up for myself, think of myself. And the interviewer in the last example asks a parent, would you say you've noticed any changes in her as she's come to group? And the parent says, yeah, she's actually more receptive to criticism and more open to different ideas and to do things. She has more of an accessible smile now. So how does this happen, that learning mindfulness and being part of this arts-based group can improve self-esteem? So this is an example of an activity that is meant to teach the concept of mindfulness. So we call this the thought jar. So I want you to imagine that you all have a jar that's half filled with water, and I would ask you to put all your thoughts and your feelings into that jar. So each thought and feeling is represented by one bead, right? So when you shake that jar, everything's swirling around, and you know that feeling when you have like 100 things going on in your head at once, and you might be feeling really overwhelmed, or you might be feeling really anxious. That's sort of represented by the jar where you see everything swirling around, right? And what happens when you let things settle to the bottom? You stop swirling that jar, right? That sort of represents a much more calm mind, a much more mindful way of being. And when you're mindful, you can actually look in there and you can see what those feelings and thoughts are, right? So the point is you can make better choices about your feelings and your thoughts, right? That's the sort of power of mindfulness. So mindfulness is really about improving your ability to pay attention to what's happening right now, and through that process, seeing things without judging them. So why do we teach mindfulness using arts-based activities? Because for those of you who are aware of mindful programs, not a lot of people are necessarily doing that. So vulnerable children can become very easily frustrated and disengaged. They might have poor listening skills, and they might have even trouble remaining physically still. So the arts-based activities really engage children in the group work. We've had no problem keeping children in the group once they agree to come. And arts-based activities can teach concepts, they can help develop skills, certainly encourage nonverbal expression, which obviously is really important for young people. And they can foster mutual aid, which is when the group members learn to help each other and solve problems together. And the other thing that I would mention today is the importance of group work. So the group work promotes normalization and validation and a sense of belonging, which is important for all of us, but particularly for children who are marginalized. And it's a strengths-based program, meaning that we really try to foster group decision-making and ownership. So what I want to do to just finish up my presentation is I want to show you just a short 4-minute video of Karina, who's a past participant in HAP, talking about her experience.
It's a really fun art group. You can talk about your feelings and meet new people. You can say you have trouble with something. They like to help you. And it's just really, really fun. At the beginning of our first session, we did our rule board where we had to write all the group rules down. And most of them was about being kind and including everybody, and not making fun of them for what they wear, what they say, and sharing and just being kind and stuff. And instead of doing don't be mean or don't make fun of other people, they say be kind to others instead of using a negative term. Because you're setting up a role model for other people, including yourself, by you thinking good things about yourself. If you think good things about yourself and you show it, you could be a role model for lots of other people. I think they use art because it helps people express their feelings more than talking it out, because for some people it's hard to talk it out because it may be hard for them to talk about their feelings in words. So they use art to express it. Being sad is kind of like you're falling a bit and you need to fight your way back up into the light to be happy again, and it's just not a good feeling, and your stomach gets into knots and it feels tense. But when I go to group, if I feel that way, I feel better. You get into a comfortable position on your chair and close your eyes and just breathe really slowly and just keep thinking, be quiet and just be calm and think about what the story is and just imagine it in your head. It helps you to visualize the picture and to use your imagination to create a story through words and images in your head. I usually get upset a lot at home and stuff, and if something that I do sometimes, if I'm getting really annoyed with somebody or schoolwork or something, I sometimes think about the group and just visualize what it's like there and being happy. Being happy feels like there's sun shining down on you, and there's lots of things that you like around you and they like you too. You feel like butterflies and balloons carrying you in the sky. I feel very powerful and glad that I can do something that I want without getting worried that I'm going to get in big trouble or I'm doing something very wrong and mean. I find here that you're open to be yourself and you shouldn't be worried to be scared of anything of what you say, because the people are very nice here and they are always caring about what you say and take it through their mind before they say something else. They obviously expect you to be kind and stuff, but they don't expect you to be somebody you're not. Facts aren't always what they seem. Once in a while, to be healthy, you need to use your imagination and have fun. The artwork helps you express your feelings physically. It's kind of like just expressing your feelings out of your system, but without blurting it out, just letting it go onto a piece of paper. I'm really looking forward to doing even more things that we haven't done yet, and I want it to go on a lot longer because it's so much fun. I'm looking forward to seeing all the other people that I am friends with there, and I'm friends with everyone there because they're all so nice and kind and helpful. I really like it, and I wish I could go every day.
All right. Up next, we have Francisco Leary from University of Guelph. He's going to be talking about substance abuse. There's 3 research programs currently being developed in his laboratory. The first explains the neurobiological mechanisms involved in the reacquisition of drug-seeking behavior, a learning process central to drug relapse. The recent studies have focused on the reacquisition of heroin-seeking using intravenous self-administration, conditioned place preference, intracranial administration, and immunohistochemistry. I hope I said that right. The second focuses on studying the behavioral effects of exposure to drugs of abuse, with specific emphasis on modulation of learning, memory, and reward-seeking behavior by heroin, methadone, and cocaine. The third program of research focuses on the comorbidity between mood disorders and vulnerability to drug and food addictions. Their animal studies are aimed at uncovering common neurobiological substrates that predispose an individual to develop a depressed phenotype, as well as compulsive alcohol, nicotine, heroin, cocaine, and food seeking. Please welcome Francisco Leary to the stage.
Is it working? Yeah. I'm going to move here because I need to point at the screen. So thank you for having me here. And it's great to share with you some of the things that I've learned as a professor and as a student. And this is a symposium on research in the university, why it matters, and we'll try to convey that to you in the context of substance use disorders. The first thing I should do is to make a distinction between using drugs and having a disorder. There is a big difference. And the difference is that once you get into the disorder state, you meet a certain number of criteria that are used to diagnose a disorder. And you have to meet a certain number of these criteria. And some of them have nothing necessarily to do with the drug. In fact, it's more about whether the drug interferes with your life. So just going to go back. This is the, go back like this. Yeah, so this is the manual that is used to diagnose mental disorders in North America. The 5th edition has just been released. And the criteria for substance dependence are 11. And you can see that the first one is about taking the drug, the substance, for in larger amount and longer time than intended. So this is about when you want to stop and you really can't. And in fact, this is the second criteria, trying to stop on a constant basis. And it's interesting that that's the defining criteria of substance dependence, is the desire to stop on a regular basis and inability to do so. So then there is an issue of spending time, being concerned with using of the drugs, recovering from the use of the drugs. For the first time in the DSM, there has been introduction of the idea of cravings. strong desire and urge to use the drug. And then there is about this concept of having the drug interfering with your life, so giving up school, giving up work, giving up family, all the normal things that most people do on a regular basis. Once the drugs start to interfere with that, the drug itself, the use, then it becomes pathological. And of course, somebody tells you have to stop drinking, otherwise you will die, and you keep drinking, or stop smoking, or you will get lung cancer, you keep smoking. That's another example of using a substance in face of situations where you're clearly going to have some problems physically. And then only the last two phenomena really are criteria related to the drug itself: tolerance, having to take more, and withdrawal, getting sick when you stop using the drug. So these are the criteria that are used for the diagnosed. I guess the question is, why do I care about this? Why do I'm interested in this? I grew up in a beautiful city, Rome. In the 80s, 70s, late 70s, 80s. It wasn't as chaotic as it is today, but it was still like one of those metropolis, And I lived in a section of Rome that was very quiet. Lots of parks around it, very quiet at night, and fields, and very strange, almost downtown, but with big parks around it. And the one thing that struck me at that age, I was pretty young. Imagine, I was going to school in the morning, I was 10, 11 years old or something like that, and I would walk, and I would see on the floor syringes. And I would ask my father, what is this stuff? Why the syringes outside on the sidewalk? And he would say, well, that's people that do drugs. With syringes? Yeah, they actually inject themselves with drugs. And over the years, I saw syringes on trees. I saw syringes under the cars, to the point that my father said, don't go and play in the park because you're going to get stabbed by one of those syringes. And plus then AIDS came along, and then it became dangerous, stay away from these things. Now, of course, people were using heroin or cocaine. I mean, a variety of drugs can be injected. But that's something that really marked me, and something that I always kept with me. How can anybody take a syringe in a car, get stuff that they bought illicitly, mix it, and inject it intravenously? I mean, these are not doctors. This is not something that is prescribed to you. Why would you ever want to do that? So that was a curiosity that I kept with me for quite a number of years. And I was able to start to address this issue, at least my curiosity, and start to learn about why when I started to university. And I did my undergraduate and graduate work at McGill. And McGill was, and still is, one of the important centers in neuroscience in the world, including the study of motivation, learning, and addictions. And I was told a fantastic story that of something that happened in the 50s, and it was a mistake. It was Olsen Milner at McGill. They were studying regions of the brain in rats that, if stimulated, activate an animal. So which region of the brain can you stimulate to have an animal move around? And they made a mistake because this kind of brain surgeries, they're done. You don't really know what you're doing because you're putting a little electrode under general anesthesia. The animal's not suffering, but you don't really know where it goes. And they made a mistake, and they were training the animals. This is a story, and there's different versions of the story depending who tells you the story. But there was this large field, and this is the field. This is the type of field that we're using, and they were delivering little stimulation to the brain of the rat, and they found in this particular subject, in this rat, that after the stimulation, it will go back to the same place where the stimulation was delivered, as if the rat wanted more. Now, these two people, as university scientists, were very intelligent. I mean, the intelligence really is making mistake and learning from the mistake. So rather than dismissing the observation, they said, well, let me see where that electrode went. And they found this particular site, and then they repeated the experiment, and they found similar results. And eventually, they connected that electrode to a wire to a lever that they presented to the animal. And they check what the animal will do. And what they discovered is that the animal will self-stimulate the brain. So they discovered the phenomenon of intracranial self-stimulation. Now, this, of course, has exploded the area, I mean, in terms of like studying the brain and motivation. And many research groups all across the world followed up. And now, of course, the research is very large, and there's a lot of evidence that has been generated from this initial observation. The one study that I guess I would like to present here, or let's tell you about, is something that I was made aware not long ago by a talk from our president, that was at University of Toronto, by the way, Franco Bacterino. And I went and looked for this study, and this is possibly one of those dark sides of research in medical institutions. This is a case study. Very difficult to find this thing, but is a subject where this professor health was testing, trying to find regions of the brain that were associated with epileptic seizures. And one thing led to another, I have to say. I mean, I don't know what's the story behind this, but I know what's written in this manuscript is that he decided to connect the electrode that was implanted in the brain of this patient to a stimulator attached to some particular buttons. And then essentially gave the machine to this person and say, do what you want to do. And this is what's written. The electrodes were placed in various sites. And when he was in the septal region, this person stimulated 1,200 times, 1,500 times, 900 times. Just pressed the button to stimulate its own brain. And then he protested each time the unit was taking it away from him, pleading to self-stimulate just a few more times. And this is probably what's interesting. I mean, this is what you have is the rat situation transposed into a human being. But the rats don't really tell you what they feel. But this person could. And he said the patient reported a feeling of pleasure, alertness, and warmth. So now, the region of the brain that was targeted in this strange study and has been targeted for many years in the animal work is a particular pathway that contains dopamine. Now, there are several pathways, but this is the famous one, dopaminergic pathway, mesolimbic system. So the origin is the cells are found in the ventral tegmental area, and the projection is dopamine to a variety of regions, but one of the famous targets of this projection is the nucleus accumbens, the ventral striatum in humans. And now, then this takes me to the question of drugs. This is recognized by several people, including myself to some degree, as the pleasure center. It's not really a center, it's a pathway, and there is not one, there are several, but this is certainly one of them. And the reason of why drugs can induce the behavior that I described that are very difficult to understand for people that are not at that level of usage is that these drugs can go in the brain and activate the system. They do it in different ways, but they all converge there. So we got alcohol, which is a legal substance, that does it, that activates that pathway. Heroin does it, cocaine does it, morphine does it, nicotine does it as well, and so on. So that's the idea then, is that with these substances have the ability of stimulating this pathway, therefore to produce approach behavior that can escalate to addiction. Now, it is true. The work that has been done through imaging of the human brain has elucidated a lot of these processes, and also has taken the research away from the animals, because, I mean, so far you can go with animals. So one set of data that is interesting that I would like to show you here, this is the imaging of the dopamine receptors in the human brain. And the more red there is, and the more dopamine receptors you have. And these are different studies where you have a control group here, and these are the addicted group, or the drug-using group, or the substance-dependent group. And so the less red you see, it means less dopamine receptors. And then you can see these are the smokers. These are normal people that don't smoke, and these are the smokers that is less red. These are normal. This is the control group. These are the alcoholics, and there is less red in the striatum. These are normal people. These are the obese individual, and this less red. And then you have the cocaine addict, and it's the same type of thing. This is quite something, because now we're not talking about cocaine here in the obese subjects. We're not talking about alcohol. We're talking about food. So it's as if modification in this particular system are not necessarily related to the drugs, but are related to the behavior that is around the drugs. And the drugs don't have to be drugs themselves. They can be other substances, including food, and of course, gambling and so on. So you see where I'm going with this. So in the lab, we have been doing a lot of experiments with drugs, as was described. Recently, we've been interested in sugars, and this is the type of studies that we do in the lab. We implant rats with catheters. Typically, they go in the veins of the animals, and then we attach the syringe to the line to a syringe, and we fill it up with drugs. So we have intravenous drug self-administration. Instead of stimulating the brain, they inject themselves with drugs, essentially. That's the situation. And this particular studies here, the catheter, rather than go intravenously, goes in the mouth. So it's intraoral cannula. And these studies are done in collaboration with Linda Parker, that is actually sitting there. And so essentially here what we're doing is that we're asking the question, will a rat self-administer sugar in their mouth? Yes or no? Now, does it matter which sugar is it? Yes or no? And what is the impact on the brain? And of course, the target that we study is dopamine. So this is the only study from my lab that I'm going to be showing you. So this is self-administration over 20 days. What we're comparing here is three sugars, or three sweeteners, let's say. The first one is high fructose corn syrup. You know, the evil, the bad sugar that they put in the food that makes you obese. So that's what we're looking at. The other one is sucrose, which is regular sugar, the white sugar. And the last one is saccharin, so it's non-caloric, but it's sweet, low concentrations. Now, you can see that the self-administration of the three sugars is completely different. Well, saccharin is not self-administered, so it tells you it's not about the fact that it's sweet that maintains self-administration. It's something else, the caloric value. And then we find some interesting differences between high fructose corn syrup and sucrose, even though those solutions have the same caloric value. So just to tell you right now, it does matter how much fructose versus glucose you have in what you consume. At least that's what the rat tells us. But the point here was, if we extract the brain at the end of 20 days and we look, can we see any alterations in the dopamine systems? And of course the answer is yes, otherwise I wouldn't show you this. Here is we measure the D2 receptors in the rat brain, in a region that corresponds to the human brain that I showed you before. And this is a decrease in dopamine mRNA, so presumably it's less active receptors. And you can see that the greatest decrease, significant decrease, is in the animals that were self-administering high fructose corn syrup. Okay, now though, there is another dimension of this that I would like to cover, and this is an interesting dimension to do in the context of substance use, following up on what was presented previously. Now, so let's say we agree that we have a reward center in the brain, or pathways, sure, we should agree, that's a fact. Well, there's all the other centers as well, and judgment, a region of the brain that is involved in judgment is there too. And this is the prefrontal cortex that was discussed before. So in fact, as you can see, part of the dopamine that is also sent is sent to the prefrontal cortex. It's the same type of region that was just discussed. So now, these studies are often described in the context of substance dependence. They're really about stress. It's very interesting stuff. Rajita Sinas from Yale. And what you see up there is the type of approach that she has. She has different approaches. She exposes people to their own stressors, or she makes a list of what people describe as stress, and she looks at the relationship between those events, the brain, and substance dependence or substance use. And what she has several papers. This is an interesting one to show. That's where she puts together a list of events that are predictive of addiction risk. And if you look at these, you probably understand why. I mean, I understand why. Loss of a parent, divorce, isolation, forced to live apart, loss of home, victim of gun shooting or other violent acts. I mean, all these things, you put them all together, physical neglect. I mean, these are stressors. It has nothing to do with drugs. But these are stressors that apparently are related to becoming more likely or having a risk of developing a dependence. And what she's found is that the more of these you have, and the smaller is the portion of the brain that controls your behavior. It shrinks almost. The more stressors, the less capable you are to control your behavior. And you can see now what the problem is. You have the drugs that activate your system, your motivation, your liking. And at the same time, if you combine over that a life full of stressors, you are impairing your ability to control the behavior that the drugs are essentially driving. And this is something that she's published in Scientific American, and this is exactly the concept that was described before. The prefrontal cortex is active, it inhibits all these more basic, primordial, let's say, centers that activate your behavior. Once this is gone, your brick is gone, and the behavior is expressed. So now the question often people say, okay, well, if that's the case, and drugs, of course, can interfere with the activity of that system, and let's say you stop using drugs when you're 30, when you're 40, after a life of like 20 or 30 years of addiction, can you go back? Can you be normal again? We don't really know. We don't really know. It's very difficult to do the research that will give you an answer to this. There are some studies that have been done. This is always using imaging. This is non-specific. This is not about dopamine. This is about general cerebral metabolic activity. So the more color you see and the more activity there is. This is normal person arrest. This is a cocaine abuser 10 days after they stop using drugs, cocaine, crack cocaine in this case. And you see the brain looks different. And this is the brain of the same people 100 days later. And it's still not close to what the normal brain should look like. So the conclusion here is that, substance use is a very complex issue. There are rewards around us, of course, drugs, foods, gambling. There's all those things around us. There are stressors that are part of our life. Sometimes something that we don't deserve. Sometimes we can't escape it, just right there. These factors combined together can increase risk of developing a problem. Then, of course, there is factors that protect you from those developing these issues. Education, age. Younger you are, the more likely you are to start to, getting problems with drugs as you age. The risk decreases, except for alcohol. And then, so this is your environment. And then you have your internal environment, your body. You have your genetic background that, of course, plays an important role in the risk to develop addiction. There are epigenetic events here, that is the effect that the environment has on the expression of your genome, which is also something that it's very important to describe. Your genome is not static. And then there is plasticity, how your brain changes as a result of your experience. And drugs and using drugs and abusing drugs is an experience in itself. And with the wrong combinations of all the elements, You may end up here where you have an overlap, where all these things come together, and that's where you may develop substance use disorders. That's it. Thank you.
So before we get to our last speaker, how's everybody doing? So that's a question. Can we hear some noise? Can we hear something? All right, can I just encourage everybody to just take a minute, just stand up, take a stretch, and then we'll have our final speaker and open it up for questions and answers. So just a quick stretch. Okay. So up next, we have Dr. Alan Kaplan, who's currently the Vice Dean for Graduate and Life Science Education and Professor of Psychiatry in the Faculty of Medicine, University of Toronto. He was previously Director of the Institute of Medical Science. He's also Senior Scientist, Campbell Family Mental Health Research Institute at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and Director of the Eating Disorder Community Treatment Program at Toronto General Hospital. His research over the past 30 years has focused on innovative treatment approaches for eating disorders, on the genetics of anorexia and bulimia nervosa. He has published over 150 peer-reviewed journal articles, 2 books, 50 book chapters, and over 250 abstracts. He was the head of the Toronto General Eating Disorder Program from 1994 to 2006, and the inaugural chair holder of the Loretta Ann Rogers Chair in Eating Disorder at the University Health Network, the first endowed chair in eating disorders in the world. He was president of the Academy for Eating Disorders from 2001 to 2002, and president of the International Eating Disorder Research Society from 2005 to 2006. He has been a continuously funded peer review investigator since 1992 and has received federal grant support from the National Institute of Mental Health in the US and the Canadian Institute of Health Research in Canada. So now I turn over to Dr. Alan Kaplan.
Thank you very much. People hear me? So I've spent 35 years immersed in treating and researching eating disorders. My colleague spoke previously about normal eating behavior, snacking, which we all do. I'm going to be focusing on very disturbed eating behavior. So let me start with basic definition. What's an eating disorder? So very misunderstood concept. And, there's a tremendous amount of misinformation generally about eating disorders. They're severe psychiatric conditions. In order to have an eating disorder, you need 2 things. You need disturbed eating behavior. That could be severe caloric restriction. That could be binge eating. That could be purging. But you also need psychopathology. It's a psychological disturbance. And those 2 are required. So if you just looked at the behavior, a lot of the behaviors that we deal with do occur on a continuum. So when is normal eating turned to overeating, turned to binge eating, right? Exercising is another example. So some of our patients exercise in an extremely unhealthy way, but exercise does occur on a continuum as well, as does caloric restriction. 70% of young women are restricting their calories. So it's the combination of the disturbed behavior to an extreme and characteristic psychological disturbance. Obesity per se is not an eating disorder. Obesity is incredibly misunderstood in the lay press and by the public. So what percent do you think if we went out to Front Street and stopped people who were obese, 100 people, what percent meet this definition? What percent of those 100 obese people have a disturbed eating behavior and characteristic psychiatric disturbance? Anybody know?
What does obese mean?
Obese is defined generally by BMI. So mild obesity is a BMI of over 30, moderate is a BMI of over 35, and severe is a BMI over 40. So the answer is the majority of people that you would stop on the street do not meet this criteria, right? So obese people generally are not more psychiatrically ill than non-obese people, and they don't have more abnormal eating behaviors than non-obese people. It's misunderstood. There is a significant minority, and it's about 35% who do. but it's not everybody who's obese. So obese is really understood generally as a metabolic disturbance that has a complex etiology. And that's about all I'm going to say about obesity. So there are 3 recognized eating disorders. The one that is probably most well known is anorexia nervosa. Anorexia nervosa has been around for centuries. In fact, there's a book called Holy Anorexia about the occurrence of anorexia within the Catholic Church and the nunnery dating back to the year 1000. It was first described in the medical literature in 1689. Anorexia is a disorder that's easy to diagnose because there's no other condition in medicine where a person, usually a young woman, intentionally starves herself at the cost of her psychological and physical well-being. And it's intentional. And generally speaking, the person who's doing this is in denial about the severity of it. So it's caloric restriction. As the person loses weight, she becomes increasingly fearful of gaining weight. So it's paradoxical. And the wording's a bit, mixed up there with the transformation. But the third characteristic is a disturbed body image. So I run a clinic at Toronto General. A 68-pound woman told me the other day that she was fat. She actually believes that. And when you talk about neuroscience, there's a part of the brain that is responsible for interoceptive integration of bodily sensation. It's called the insula, and we know now that the insula is not functioning normally in people with anorexia nervosa. So this is not something she's making up. It's a real perception, but it's a distortion. And anorexia is subtyped. The restricting subtype, that's a group of people who have anorexia and they just restrict their intake, and a binge purge subtype. What's the epidemiology of anorexia? About 1% of women between the ages of 18 and 45 will develop anorexia in the course of her life, and that figure is consistent across all westernized society. It's no difference in Hong Kong, in big cities in Southeast Asia, in Europe, 1% of young women. And about 10% of cases are men. What's important to know about anorexia is it's deadly. All right, so it has the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric illness in psychiatry. And when you juxtapose that fact against the fact that we have no evidence-based treatments for it, it becomes a very difficult disorder to deal with. It's the only disorder in psychiatry for which there's no approved drug. So people tend to romanticize anorexia, and I'll say a little bit more about it, but it's an absolutely horrendous condition. It destroys the lives of our daughters, our sisters, our mothers sometimes, and sometimes it kills them. Bulimia nervosa is the second recognized eating disorder. So people with bulimia tend to be of normal weight, and their illness is characterized by binge eating. Now, binge eating is not having a second piece of cake or 3 cookies. It's eating thousands of calories in a short period of time, and it's almost always followed by vomiting or some other way of compensating. Excessive exercise or starvation. And so people with bulimia, despite the fact that they're consuming a lot of food, they don't keep the food down and they maintain a normal weight, which is quite remarkable. These are the criteria, the DSM-5 criteria that was alluded to earlier. The frequency, again, binge eating, overeating is ubiquitous, especially if you go on college campuses. That doesn't mean that 80% of people have bulimia. It's the frequency. The question is at what frequency of binge eating. It's like cough, right? Just because you have a cough, it doesn't mean you have pneumonia or lung cancer. But if you're coughing multiple times a day, there's something wrong, right? It's not just an innocuous symptom. And the frequency that carries with it the psychiatric disturbance is at least once a week or more. So most people with bulimia are binging and vomiting multiple times a day. And again, it consumes most of their day and destroys their life. Doesn't necessarily kill them at an earlier age, but it has a high morbidity and takes a huge toll. And bulimia is more common than is anorexia. So it's about 2 to 3% of women between the ages of 18 and 45 will develop bulimia nervosa. And once again, men account for about 10% of cases. The third eating disorder is binge eating disorder. This is the relative newcomer. So this is a newly coined diagnosis, just accepted by DSM-5. What's binge eating disorder? That's the 35% of the obese group that I was referring to earlier. That's a group of people, and they're quite different in many ways. They're binge eating at a regular rate, but they don't compensate. So they actually do pay the price for their consumption, and they tend to binge themselves up to an obese weight. And then they have to deal with all of the medical and psychological consequences of being obese. But the primary driver of the obesity is overeating and binge eating. And so the difference between bulimia nervosa and binge eating disorder is in binge eating disorder there's no compensation. And BED, which is the acronym for better or worse, binge eating disorder, is the commonest eating disorder. And what's interesting about BED is the gender breakdown, because about 25 or 30% of people with BED are men. So much more common in men than bulimia nervosa or anorexia nervosa. So what causes an eating disorder? What do you think? What would you say causes an eating disorder? Feel free to yell out what you think. Controlling parents. Sorry? Stress? Okay. So if I asked you what caused cancer, what causes cancer, what would you say? Or heart disease, right? The point is there isn't one cause actually for any illness. Even if all of us were exposed to a virus, let's say the influenza virus, only a small percentage of us would actually get ill. And that's because illness is multi-determined. Even something as what seems as straightforward as infectious disease, it's not straightforward. And much more so the case with psychiatric illnesses. So some of the theories you see here, caused by a disturbed society, disturbed family, as somebody pointed out, personality, mood, brain, genes, all of these contribute. Neither one is the sole cause. So if you want to understand the biopsychosocial nature of eating disorders, you have to understand that there are predisposing factors, primarily genetics. Most of my research in the last 15 years has focused on the genetics of eating disorder. 15 years ago, I couldn't say, backed by hard scientific evidence, that anorexia nervosa is largely genetic. I can say that today without any doubt, and the evidence is clear. That doesn't mean that it's the single cause. It's hard to get anorexia without the genetic risk. You don't get it by reading Glamour magazine. Again, this misconception. There are psychological factors that predispose an individual, and there are sociocultural factors. The important thing that all of these impinge on an individual, usually a young adolescent girl, and I'll explain why that is in a minute, who decides, and I have a daughter, thank heaven she's healthy, but she went through adolescence like every other girl, and I heard her talking to her friends, and self-esteem, as we heard about, takes a battering in young women during adolescence. Young women don't generally feel great about themselves with their body changing, and the predisposed individual is going to say, I don't feel good about myself, but if I lose weight, maybe I'll feel better. And so that individual goes on a diet, starts to restrict, and begins to enter what we call a starvation syndrome. Most young girls who go on a diet will get off the diet because they're healthy enough to realize that it's not making them feel better, it's actually making them feel worse. They can't sleep, they're irritable, they can't concentrate at school, and the healthier young woman's going to say, this is crazy. I don't feel better, I feel worse. I don't think this is working, and will stop the caloric restriction. But the young girl who's vulnerable is going to pursue this and end up essentially locked into the starvation syndrome. Now, what do I mean by that? We learned from very elegant studies in the 1940s that starvation is a final common pathway. So in the 1940s, towards the end of World War II, the U.S. government hired a military psychiatrist named Ancel Keys. Why did they do this? They were liberating the concentration camps in Europe and the prisoner of war camps in Japan, and these people were starved. They were starved for political, religious reasons or being tortured. And they said to these folks, eat now, you can eat whatever you want. And remarkably, a lot of these people started binge eating to the point of death. And the physicians in the military had no understanding of this. So they said to Keyes, you can do some experiments and figure out what's going on. He took 36 conscientious objectors, sequestered them in a military compound in Minneapolis in 1945, and invited their families, their girlfriends, and they were going to starve these guys for a year in return for not being punished for not going to fight. The study was stopped. These are 18-year-old healthy men. They were excluded if they had any psychiatric history. The study was stopped after 3 months because the investigators were amazed what happened to these men. It was actually suspended when one of them developed a manic episode, became psychotic, and amputated his hand. He had no previous psychiatric history. What does this tell us? It tells us how much of a perturbation caloric restriction is to the brain and how it changes people. And so there's changes in cognition. These men got obsessed with food. They had dreams about food. They became very moody, depressed, irritable. Their endocrine system shut down. So in women, menses cease. And these men, 18-year-old military guys, they lost all their sex drive. And the girlfriends were complaining. And their autonomic nervous system downregulated in an attempt to conserve energy in the face of decreasing energy. Blood pressure, pulse rate, so they started to get faint when they stood up. Their body temperature dropped precipitously, and they were cold all the time. You can see and pick out the anorexics in the summertime because they're wearing winter coats. They are actually hypothermic. And this is an attempt to conserve energy that our body does. And most interesting is once the study was stopped and the investigators told the men, never mind, you can go home, 75% of them started to binge eat. And they reported having lost satiety signals. They did not know when they were full. And eating disorders are disorders of satiety. They are not disorders of hunger. And that's an important concept. And I've interviewed some of these guys many years later because my colleague in Minnesota has kept in touch with them. And that 3-month period of starvation changed the course of their life. Not every one, but many of them, forever. And they reported never getting back to normal after that period. In our patients, they binge eat, they purge, it makes them feel worse about themselves. It's not a good thing for your self-esteem to have your head in a toilet bowl half the day. And then they go to their weight loss program, doesn't matter which one, because they're all the same, whether it's Jenny Craig, Weight Watchers. The reason you're binging is you're not trying hard enough. You have to diet more. So obviously that's pouring fuel on the fire, and this is when people present for care because they're locked into this vicious cycle. So let's go through some of these factors. I've spent a lot of time on the genetics, so I don't have time to give you a crash course in human genetics, but suffice to say that weight is very much a heritable characteristic and trait. And if you want to map the eating disorders on a weight continuum, anorexics are always underweight, that's diagnostic. Bulimics are normal weight, and binge eating disorder folks are overweight. What interested me when I was in medical school and doing my residency in medicine was this fact. It was amazing to me that someone could actually starve themselves to the point of death. Suggested to me that something was hardwired in the brain, because if you think about it, teleologically, for survival, that makes no sense. It makes a lot more sense in the face of caloric restriction that your brain would send out signals to overeat. So binge eating actually makes sense in the face of caloric restriction as a survival mechanism, but the ability to actually starve yourself without your body trying to protect itself, to me, was the first clue that there's something genetic going on in the brains of these people. And in fact, that led me to pursue, and my colleagues, the genetic basis for anorexia nervosa. So it's not one gene we're talking about, right? There are conditions that are due to one gene. So if you have the Huntington's gene, you will get Huntington's chorea. It's as simple as that. If you have the recessive gene for cystic fibrosis and you get both genes from your parents, you will also get cystic fibrosis. Most conditions in humans are only partially inherited. And some have nothing to do with inheritance characteristics. So your religious affiliation has no bearing, it's not affected at all by your genes. So what are the characteristics of partially inherited disorders? They aggregate in families. So do eating disorders run in families? What do you think? Yeah, absolutely. So if you have a first-degree relative, let's say you're one of two daughters and your sister has anorexia nervosa, your rate of developing or your risk of developing anorexia is 12 times higher than if she did not have an eating disorder. So it's a significant risk. And the relative risk for eating disorders is highest for anorexia, and especially for that subgroup of restrictors that I referred to earlier, which makes sense based on what I was just saying. But this doesn't tell us, just studying families, that it's genetic. Maybe there's something familial in the environment. So you have to study, to answer that question, the only way you can answer it is by studying twins. So monozygotic or identical twins share 100% of their genes. They have the exact same genetic complement, and dizygotic twins, or non-identical twins, are like any sibling. They share 50% of their genes. So if you can show that the rate of a disorder is higher in the monozygotic twins versus the dizygotic twins, you've demonstrated that the disorder is highly genetic. And it allows us to do a biological experiment. So in a population, we look at the concordance of anorexia nervosa in identical twins versus dizygotic. This is an old slide. That's the Olsen twins, and that's the Bush twins back in the 90s, right? And as you can see, the Olsen twins are identical. The Bush twins look very different. So what is the concordance rate if one twin, identical twin, has anorexia? What is the concordance rate for the other twin? It's close to 80%. Close to 80%. Whereas in the dizygotic twins, it's the same as what I just said. It's between 10 and 12% risk. So when you're looking at contribution, and this is a bit of a play on words, genes are genes, the source of resemblance can come from shared genes or a shared environment. What separates out twins is the non-shared environment, the unique experience, right? And when you do mathematical statistical computations, genetic, what we find statistically is that about 70% of the variance, the cause of anorexia, is due to genes, and about 30% is due to the unique environment. What do I mean by that? That's the scenario where you have identical twins. The parents take one of the twins out for dinner that night, and they leave the other twin with the neighbor's son who's babysitting, and he molests that twin. So that's a unique experience that only one of the twin has. The other twin was not exposed to that. And we know sexual abuse is a significant risk factor, childhood sexual abuse, for an eating disorder. So what does this tell us? It tells us that 50 to 80% of the variance in liability is due to genes. Impact of shared environment is not substantial, so it's not due specifically to faulty parenting. The parenting that we see that may be disturbed is usually a result of having a starved child, which would disturb most parents, as opposed to a cause. Now, certainly there are individual examples where that's the case, where there is a significant contribution from the parent, but as a general rule, if you look at group statistics, it's not significant. And anorexia and bulimia are markedly heritable. And the other thing that is important is gender. Why do women have why are eating disorders predominantly in women and not men? That question has never been able to be answered until only about 8 or 9 years ago. And again, it was always thought to be a misogynistic, paternalistic society that objectifies women. That's important, but that does not explain why this has held up over hundreds of years, that predominantly the disorder of women. What is that? And the answer is, and I don't have time to get into the experiments, but women's brains are much more sensitive to dietary manipulation than are men's brains. When a man goes on a diet, he does not change his brain chemistry. When a woman goes on a diet, she changes her brain chemistry to an extraordinary degree. And that change in chemistry puts her at risk for a whole bunch of psychiatric disorders, including eating disorders. And so it is a gender-specific thing, and it has to do with the neurobiologic differences between men and women. And more specifically, levels of circulating estrogen and progesterone, which don't occur in men. And women know that your eating changes during your menses, changes dramatically during pregnancy and the postpartum period. We knew this, but we now fully understand what this does to the brain. So the psychological risk factors, again, I don't have time to go into it, but we know that young girls who go on to develop anorexia have issues of identity, self-esteem, before they develop the illness. Autonomy, this is a group, and if you do retrospective studies, there's a much higher rate of school refusal and school phobia in people who go on to develop anorexia. They are afraid to differentiate and separate from their family, and usually from the mother. And I already commented on the sexual abuse issue. If you look at these traits, they're all challenged during adolescence, right? What is the job of an adolescent? It's to develop a separate identity. It's to be able to have a positive self-esteem. It's to be able to separate and individuate from your family and become an independent person. And it's to have a healthy sense of sexuality. All of those things are challenged in adolescence, and the child who enters adolescence at risk can't manage that, can't negotiate adolescence. Starving yourself and reverting to a prepubescent state is one way to deal with it. It's a compromise, but it works. Right? So if you understand the psychological and developmental aspects of the eating disorders, it makes sense why the risk factor, the biggest precipitating factor, is actually adolescence. So let's go to family, vocation. So what role does a family play? So a family, parents, can protect a child by providing a more forgiving environment, or can exacerbate the pressures on a young girl during her growth and development. So my daughter at 5 said she wanted to take dance classes. I took her to a ballet class, and I'm not hammering ballet or criticizing ballet generally. For certain kids, it's not a good thing. And when I went into that class, I was horrified. They were all little girls. The room was surrounded by mirrors. The teacher was mean, and the girls were having a miserable time. They were not happy. I then took her to a modern dance class. Little guys, little girls, the teacher was hilarious, no mirrors, lots of laughing and play. So you know which class my daughter went into. So again, think of it this way. If you know you have a family history, or you have had a history yourself of alcoholism, why would you encourage your child to become a bartender? Right? You're putting a vulnerable child genetically in a high-risk environment. Know your child. That's the message that I'm giving. So what are some of these high-risk activities? So competitive athletics, dance, ballet in particular, modeling, especially young girls modeling. And these are tragic examples of that. So you've all read the newspapers, you know about this. In fact, there are now some countries where it's illegal for modeling agencies to hire young girls if their BMI is under 18. Some countries in Scandinavia, Israel has instituted a new law like that. We need to do that here. And modeling agencies are a little bit more informed now than they used to be. This was one of the most famous models, Brazilian model, who died at 21, 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighed 88 pounds. And the important quote here is from one of her co-models. Everybody knew she was ill, the other girls, the modeling agencies, but they didn't want to believe it, and they did nothing about it. And she was found dead in her apartment in Italy from probably excessive laxatives and a cardiac arrest. And it occurs with guys too. So this again was I'm not aware of this guy, but I'm told he was a very famous male model, and he developed anorexia in his late teens, and by the time he died, he was 68 pounds in 2010. So the media is a problem. So the media romanticizes, idealizes eating disorders, especially Hollywood. Every single actor on this slide has come out publicly that they've had an eating disorder. And some of these people are people that we in North America really look up to as idols, as ideals. If you ask who's the most influential woman, it's probably Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey's had binge eating disorder for years. If you notice, her weight is always going up and down, but she's genetically overweight. She talks about it. I was a visiting professor at UCLA. This is public, so I'm not divulging anything. Michael Jackson in the early 90s was a patient on the inpatient unit at UCLA. He weighed about 85 pounds. When he died of the propofol overdose, he was in the low 90s. And again, nobody talks about the fact that the cardiologist gave him the anesthetic, which he should have never done, but he gave him an adult dose, and when his body weight was that of a child, right? That's what killed him. So indirectly, he died of an eating disorder. Need I say more? So our society has this: you can never be too rich or too thin, just because, and this is really directed to the adolescents in the audience, high schoolers, just because something is deemed to be aesthetically pleasing does not make it healthy. When I was growing up, everybody was smoking. If you're watching Mad Men, you can see, because that's the era that I was a teenager in, everybody was smoking. Nobody thought about it. It was a cool thing to do. It's the number one killer, right? Preventable disease, lung cancer. This is foot binding in the Chinese culture. This is what it does to women's feet. And wearing a corset in the 30s and 40s, women actually went into pulmonary failure because they couldn't breathe, even though it was deemed to be an attractive thing to do. So kudos to the Body Shop. I have no stock in the Body Shop, but they get it right. They promote healthy women's bodies, and that's what we should all be doing. How do you tease out the genetic versus the environmental? So again, using ballet as an example, just to get the point across, here's an environment, it's a ballet class. Here's a genotype, AABB. Here's another genotype, small a, small b. One of these people becomes a prima ballerina with the National Ballet Company, and another one develops severe anorexia nervosa. It's the interplay of the genes and the environment. We need to debunk the myth of a purely societal cause for eating disorders, emphasize that it's neither genes nor environment alone. It's the interplay between the two. We in our field need to do a better job of educating the public, which is why I'm here today. Convey accurate information. There's a lot of inaccurate information out there, and provide protective environments. There's now training for women who have an eating disorder, who have gotten pregnant and have children, to try and help them develop healthier eating for their child, and not to pass on unhealthy messages. We need to separate self-esteem out from one's body or shape or performance. We need to detect symptoms early, and we need to support our young people in their struggle to reach a healthy sense of self-worth. So the take-home message is: genes load the gun, the environment pulls the trigger. And I'll leave you with this quote: with eating disorders, understanding is the first step to acceptance, and only with acceptance can there be recovery. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're running a little short on time. I'm going to open up the question and answer period to audience. If there's any questions, there's a microphone on the left and a microphone on the right. Are there any questions? Okay. So I have a question. Oh, there is? Yeah, so just the microphone. Or if you want to yell. You should use the microphone because we can't hear you.
I'll ask one while you're waiting.
Okay.
So for the first person who spoke about bullying, you didn't mention anything about the effect of bullying over time. Do you find that, if someone's bullied, say, for a couple months, maybe they're resilient to it, but then if it continues, will their resilience wear down, or do you find that how you react initially is how you'll always react?
It's a great question. So I don't know if my mic's on yet. It's going to, hopefully now it's on. So the question is a little complicated. So first I'll just speak about the longevity. It's pretty much a dose response effect. So the more you get it, the worse your outcomes are. But your initial reaction actually does have an effect on whether or not you're going to continue to be a bully, you're going to continue to be bullied or not. But most of the research comes from the early elementary years. So what studies have shown is that kids who bully others tend to run amok of the class. So they pick on everybody, and then they then hone in on a few kids who then continue to serve as victims. And unfortunately then, once that person gets a reputation for being a victim, the experience becomes entrenched. So so the initial reaction does play a role in the continuation of being bullied, but not always. What we want kids to be is assertive. Unfortunately, what we do is we tend to put the onus on the kid who's being bullied to change who they are, when I really think our response should be to change the aggressor's abuse of power. So it's complicated, but yes, there's some continuation, it becomes entrenched, the reputation becomes entrenched, and the initial reaction does play a factor in how long your experience will be.
Even if the student changes schools, so if people around them don't know, do you find they still continue?
Okay, so the question is about changing schools and do they still continue to be bullied. In the past, no. And in the past, I used to always recommend that the person change schools if it's been a long-standing issue, because again, they have a reputation and that reputation becomes entrenched. But now with social media, they change schools and their reputation's already begun, right? So before they've even moved schools, people are saying, oh, I hear Ashley's going to your school, she's such a whatever, right? So if it's really hard because you can't impression manage the way you used to. And really, the sad thing is, like, studies were like in the mid 80s, early 90s, they would teach children who, again, were being bullied, all these social skills. So social skills training was really popular then, and then they'd put them back in the classroom, and you'd see them use all of these skills that they were taught to no avail, because again, there's this reputation that this is the class whipping boy or whipping girl. It's pretty ugly, and I think that's part of the reason we're having a really hard time in the reduction of bullying, is because it's a person nested within a context that won't allow them to change their reputation or their circumstance.
Next question.
Yeah, okay. So I know you talked about how the prefrontal cortex, you're able to basically control emotions, and I feel like that's in most, I would say, mental disorders, it's usually your inability to regulate these emotions. Are there ways to basically keep the PFC active? Like in your case, when you did the experiments, you were able to basically stimulate it, right? Are there like actual synthetic ways to keep it continuously active to like help people basically with the disorders?
So for the purposes of mental health treatment, I think one of the new frontiers is actually for things like depression, for example, anxiety, to actually use exercise as part of the treatment protocol for those conditions, not as an exclusive treatment, but something that goes along with other approaches. Of course, it depends on what type of disorder. So when we're talking about other mental health conditions, exercise is kind of part of the problem. So anorexia, using exercise to an extreme to purge calories, you kind of want to get that out of their behavioral repertoire rather than put it in. But certainly the bulk of cases of depression, for example, and anxiety don't involve that. And in fact, there is some promise of exercise. One of the means by which it may help is by optimizing those cognitive control resources that you mentioned. Now, in terms of the brain stimulation techniques, I had mentioned that you can use that technique, TMS, to either upregulate or downregulate the prefrontal cortex, or any area of the cortex, actually. There is some research that's actually been going on for a couple of decades now, using TMS, but the upregulation version, to help people with severe treatment refractory depression. And there is I'm not intimately familiar with the research literature, but my understanding is there is some evidence of benefit for those individuals.
Because I know in cases like OCD also kind of links into controlling these impulses, but what they find with OCD is after basically if they try to control themselves more, the prefrontal cortex actually adapts and starts to activate more. Do you feel like if we were to basically activate the PFC using like the methods you mentioned above on a like regular basis, sooner or later the brain would be able to adapt and do it itself?
I think that's an open question. Of course, it's really important in science to say when you don't know, and I think collectively we don't know the answer to that yet. But that's the purpose of research, is to try and sort of figure some of this stuff out. But that may be a question for future studies. An interesting one.
Are there any more questions from the audience? Are there any questions from people online? No? Okay. So I just have one question. As a practitioner who works on the front line with young people and dealing with the issue of mental health, one of the things that always pops up is that of stigma. And so I'm going to pose this question to the last three presenters. What are some of the stigmas associated with the area of research that you're working on? And how has your research helped to combat some of that stigma when it comes to mental health? So yeah, any order.
Yeah, so I mean the comment that someone made in the audience was prevalent in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that, families caused their daughters to get sick with anorexia. And that obviously is a painful thing to have to accept, even though it's not necessarily true. And the stigma was associated, the need to keep that quiet. Mm-hmm. What will people say about us, a family, if they know that our daughter has a severe mental illness? The genetics research, I think, has revolutionized that view. If we now have evidence and we can help educate parents and families that a big part of why their daughter got ill was the genes that she has, and it's not due to something you may have done wrong when she was younger, I think it helps to destigmatize the disorder, as does education in general.
You guys have anything to add?
Well, I haven't done myself research on stigma, but in substance dependence, stigma is a very prominent problem, as is the attribution of responsibility for developing a drug problem. It's your choice, and you suffer the consequences of using drugs. You're a bad person. So that's the type of idea. The only thing I can say that in respect to this is that if you put cocaine in a syringe and you allow a rat to take it, the rat will take it. And there is nothing bad about the rat. There is nothing flaw in the morale of the rat, on the morality or on the upbringing of the rat. There is nothing like that. It's a biological response. And at that level, it can be understood like that. And of course, then there is an entire societal component around it, but the biological response is there.
So I guess in terms of stigma, I talked in my presentation of how the young people we work with tend to be very marginalized. These are the kids that do get bullied in school. They're constantly in trouble. They're constantly told they're bad, and they really believe that. They have a variety of challenges. Some have diagnoses, some don't. But I guess I would just emphasize the power of the group work. Often when you meet with these children one-on-one, you don't really see the challenges. The challenges arise when they come together because they have difficulties interacting, with their peers, and so that's when you see a lot of the challenges. So it's really through the group work, I think, that they feel a sense of belonging. They feel, like a lot of the kids have told us, they can be authentic in the group. They don't have to pretend to be someone that they're not. For some of them, it's the first time they meet children who have similar problems. So for the first time, they sort of get to feel normal. I'm always a bit surprised that for a lot of these kids, this is the only place where they actually feel like they belong and people are listening to them and taking them seriously. So I think group work as practitioners, group work is really, really important.
So I just want to take a moment to thank the panelists for coming and sharing your insight with us. I think that when we hear the whole topic of mental health, it's so broad, and I think you all did an excellent job of breaking down the individual areas that you're working on to help us get a better understanding of how everything works together and how everything contributes to our mental health. And you guys also provided a lot of good solutions in regards to what young people in high school can do when it comes to protecting their mental health or protecting against particular illnesses. And I really, really appreciate it. So thank you guys very, very much. And I would just like to say to everybody, enjoy the rest of your day. And can we just get a round of applause for our panelists?
I just wanted to add, my name is Donna Katsopoulos. I'm the Associate Vice President of Research at Wilfrid Laurier University. And on behalf of COU and the Research Matters campaign, I wanted to echo our moderator's comments, and I wanted to thank each of the researchers from Ontario universities for their contributions today. Clearly, the research that's happening at Ontario universities is assisting us in understanding more about mental health, demystifying mental health in the public, and ultimately improving the lives of those who suffer with mental health. So thank you on behalf of the Council of Ontario Universities.